Hello class. In the last lesson, we had learned that we had learned about consonant sounds. We were dealing with consonant sounds of the English language, and as we all know, and I had told you also in the last class that there are 26 alphabets in the English language. And these 26 alphabets together represent 44 sounds. 20 sounds are of these 44 sounds are vowel sounds, although as we have that there are 5 vowels A, E, I, O, U, but uh, uh, there are actually 20 vowel sounds, and the rest 24 sounds of the 44 sounds of English language are consonant sounds. So 26 alphabets in English represent 44 sounds, out of which 20 are vowel sounds and 24 are consonant sounds. Now, I had also told you that consonants are produced with friction and vowels are produced without friction. In the last class, we had also learned that when there are 6 things one has to keep in mind when one is describing a consonant. The 6 factors which go to describe the consonants is the airstream mechanism. What airstream mechanism is used? Most of the English or all the English sounds are produced using the pulmonic aggressive airstream mechanism. All the English sounds use the pulmonic aggressive airstream mechanism. Then we had also come to know about the state of glottis. When we go on to describe the consonant sounds, the state of glottis has to be kept in mind. Glottis, as you all know, is the space between the two vocal cords. And then you have the position of the soft palate, that is the velum, whether it is raised or whether it is lowered. If it is lowered, then it is usually a nasal sound, and if it is not, if it is raised, then it is an oral sound, and if it is in between, when both the nasal cavity and the oral cavity is open, then it is a nasalized sound. Then we had also, while producing a vowel, at least two, there are active and passive articulators. So which is the active articulator, which is the passive articulator should be known. And what is the stricture involved? Stricture is the restriction of the air passage caused by the various organs of speech. How that is, how the air stream is stopped or restricted by certain by certain organs of speech is basically called stricture. The stricture involved. So today we will be talking about the manner of articulation. As now we are, please keep in mind that we are talking about consonants. We are not talking about vowels right now. So we will be talking about the manner of articulation and how vowels are articulated or how they are produced. Now we shall look into it in detail. So if you look at the screen, then you will be able to see that there are 4 kinds of articulation that have been described here. I will explain them to you in detail. So the first is plosives. Plosives is when the manner of articulation of plosives is produced when the air stream is completely stopped and then it is let go abruptly, suddenly. Okay, complete closure of the airstream and then sudden release of it causes plosives to be produced. There is an explosive sound. Okay, when there is sudden closure, when there is complete closure of the air passage and then it is suddenly released, then the plosive sounds are produced. The active and the passive articulator, come into firm contact with each other, and therefore they stop the lung air from escaping through the mouth. The active articulator and the passive articulator come together, and what happens, they when they come together, they stop the lung air from escaping through the mouth. And then what happens, at the same time there is velic closure, that is the soft palate rises up and closes the nasal cavity. Therefore there is no chance of the air uh, air to escape from the nasal passage. So therefore when the lung air is blocked in the mouth and suddenly that oral closure is released, the active and passive articulator suddenly get removed from each other or move away from each other. That actually causes the air to escape with an explosive noise, and that is called plosives. The active and the passive articulator come together, they stop the passage of the air, they stop the air from they completely stop the passage of the air. The soft palate also rises up, closes the nasal cavity, therefore there is no chance of the air uh, uh, to escape from the nasal cavity. So suddenly then the active and the passive articulators move away from each other, and what happens, the plosive sounds are produced. The next are and what are the plosive sounds? Pa, ba, da, ka, ta, ga. These six sounds are plosive sounds. Ba, da, ka, pa, ta, ga. These are plosive sounds. Now we will be dealing with affricates. Affricates are produced when there is complete closure and then slow release of the air. Complete closure, the active and the passive articulators come completely close, and then slowly the air is released. Not with an explosion, not suddenly, but slowly it is released. The manner of articulation of affricate sounds is produced by complete closure followed by slow release, which results in friction. If active articulator is removed slowly from the passive articulator, instead of an explosive noise, a friction will be heard. The initial sounds of English words, uh, for example, chin or jam, that means the cha sound and the ja sounds are affricates, are consonants which are affricates. Why? There is sudden, there is complete closure and then there is slow release. Now, the next sound, the next kind of consonants that we will be talking about are fricatives. Fricatives are when active articulator is brought close to the passive articulator, and but there is a narrow gap between the active and the passive articulator. The soft palate is again raised. It closes the nasal passage of air. The lung air escapes through the narrow gap between the active and the passive articulator, producing again an audible friction. Sounds that are produced with stricture of close approximation are called fricatives. For example, the initial sound of English words thin, th, then are example of fricatives, where the active articulator and the passive articulator are coming uh, are are close to each other, but there is a little gap, and from that gap the air escapes, producing fricatives. Now, what are nasal sounds? Nasal sounds are nasal consonants happen because of complete oral closure. In this case, the oral cavity is closed. That means the velum is lowered or the soft palate lowers. The active articulator and the passive articulator are in firm contact with each other when we are producing a nasal sound, thereby blocking the oral passage. Oral passage is closed, remember, and why is it closed? because the soft palate, or what we know as the velum, is lowered. The nasal passage is opened, the oral passage is closed, and the lung air escapes through the nasal cavity or through the nostrils very, very freely. Uh, when we say, for example, ma, na, these sounds are nasal sounds which are produced when the oral cavity is closed because the soft palate is lowered, the nasal cavity is opened, and the sound and the air escapes through the nostrils or the nasal cavity. Now, the next kind of sounds are trills, or which is intermittent closure. That means the active articulator strikes against the passive articulator several times, and the air escapes between the active passive articulated intermittently. For example, when you say ra, red, ran, rider, root, ra is a is called a troll is called a trill or a rolled consonant. Why? Because the active and the passive articulator are striking against each other. Okay, they are striking against each other, and this kind of sound is produced. Now, next we shall come to lateral or partial closures. Okay, the active and the passive articulators are in firm contact with each other. The soft palate is raised, the nasal cavity is shut, but the sides of the tongue are lowered, and the air escapes along the side of the tongue without any friction. For example, when you say the word love, lot, light, what happens? The active and the passive articulator are in firm contact with each other, but the soft palate is raised and the nasal cavity is shut. But from the sides of the tongue, the air is escaping, and which is why we are being able to produce a lateral sound, which is called, for example, la, love, lot. So these are active. This is called partial closure. So the last kind of sound that we will, consonant sound that we will be talking about, is when there is open approximation. The active articulator is brought close to the passive articulator so that the gap between them is wide, and the air will escape through this gap without any friction. These are called semi-vowels, and they are frictionless continuance. Okay, for example, wait, yes, what happens? The active articulator and the passive articulator are brought close, but there is a wide gap between them, and the air escapes through that wide gap without any friction. And that is why these sounds are called semi-vowels, because there is no friction. And as I had told you, consonant sounds are produced because of friction, and vowel sounds do not have friction, which is why since these sounds do not have friction, these are called semi-vowels. So this is so much for the manner of articulation. We will be talking about the place of articulation in the next class. Thank you.